Hello, everybody. I wanted to provide a remote option for those who can't participate in conversations on Thursday or on Sunday morning for our study through Lent, which is Jesus' Vision for Your One Wild and Precious Life by Mark Graves. You can pick this up from your favorite online book purveyor. We do have some copies here at church as well, so you can pick it up on Sunday. So I'm going to be doing a chapter a week here online, and these will range in length of time depending on the depth I go into and the length of the chapter itself. But I'll give kind of an overview or key points that I picked up on through the various chapter, and then I will conclude with some of his reflection questions. So I'll read those questions to you that you might then think about them, ponder them, even perhaps write some responses relative to them. Now, we chose this study because it's a very different study, and I will go into this relative to his introduction. But rather than focusing on the death of Jesus and the 7 last words of Jesus, which most Lenten studies really are geared in that direction, this really focuses on the 7 essential or first words that Jesus says. So looking at how did Jesus live and what kind of life was Jesus calling us to live? Not what kind of death was Jesus calling us to. So sort of shifting the perspective and focus of what is a typical Lenten study on its head to say we're missing the point when we focus so much on the end of things, when really what we should be focusing on is the beginning of things or the core of things, as that teaches us much more about the kind of people that God was calling us to be through the life and ministry of Jesus. So again, he starts off in his introduction saying, more than Jesus's death is important. The focus in theology, and particularly in Lent, is on that. And so, substitutionary atonement espouses this. Jesus died for my sins. We could look at a crucifix and the hanging dead Jesus as a central marker in space and say it focuses on death, or any Christian space with the presence of a cross or the outside of a building. The focus is on the end of life. And while that's important, and he in no way is playing that down, he says we're really missing out in making that the most prominent and important facet. That really what we see in resurrection and what we see prior to resurrection is the focus is on life and living. And so resurrection is the victory over that. And so why we put so much emphasis in that, we're missing the key facet of what the Gospels are all about. Now, Mike Graves begins with a personal story, and he weaves his own personal stories and narratives throughout this, which I think makes it very compelling and interesting to have somebody not simply provide facts or biblical interpretation and theology, but to weave that in with their own personal story. And that personal story for him was a story of a close friend who was dying. And as he went to be with that friend, while the friend was relatively unresponsive, that friend appreciated being read to. And so he chewed on what it was that he wanted to read to this friend. And he chose a book that leaned in Christianity not on what happens when you die, but rather what happens before you die. And he says this is what really led to this study. So it was what unlocked for him the beginning of what this is here. Is this shift. So here he was with a friend who was dying, who was facing his death, and he chose a volume that really focused on life and living. And it somewhat was from a place of saying, we do not know, our faith says, but we do not know what happens after we die. What we do know is this life. And so the difference that God's grace can have in our lives is about how we live, who we are now, as much as it is in the hereafter, but it is now. And he doesn't downplay that. He says we all die. We understand that. But when we are born to live. And so ultimately, while we all will face death, it is really about how we live. So we are born to live. And Jesus was preoccupied. Jesus was not, I'm reading over my notes, was not preoccupied with death. And so neither should we be, and neither are the stories about Jesus really preoccupied with his death. So why is it that we have given so much focus to the death of Jesus? That's his question in this introduction, and his way of retooling our focus into the life of Jesus. And this has been exacerbated over history and in our worship practices in the fact that the hymns seem to focus on the death. The focus of the art seems to be on the death. So really what we have in those is the very beginning of Jesus' life, his death, and then ultimately what we are looking at is resurrection and his return. But his whole life is skipped over. So it's not in some ways a surprise that having sung these hymns for years and years, having looked upon this art, that we end up similarly placing the primary focus. We can talk about C&E Christians, which certainly used to be a phenomenon of those who only go at Christmas and Easter, being present for those moments and missing out on the whole bulk of the year or the life of Jesus. We don't know what happens after we die. Again, our faith says something, but we don't know. The life before we do die, however, that is what we know. And so he poses this question, what are we going to do with this life? This is what we know, so what are we going to do with it? How are we going to live this? So the truth is, we're all going to die someday. So how do we live knowing that? How do we really live before we die? So rather than getting to the precipice of death and knowing when it's going to occur and then starting to live our lives, he's saying, how do we live it now in a way that really allows us to live it? Not in the sense of a proverbial vacation, but really a sense of a well-lived life. And he shares his own story as a way that his life was changed by an encounter with faith and ultimately his commitment to faith, to lead to a place that he really has learned how to live. So he uses his adolescence and his youth and his early life to talk about the person he was versus the person that he is. And it's his way of recognizing and uplifting that this life that we have is a gift from God. This is God's gift. And how Jesus lived can teach us so much about how we are made to live. Not how we are made to die, but how we are made to live. And so God's gift of Jesus's life, the giving is not about his death, which is where all the focus has been, but about life. And those who respond and trust in this will find a life worth living, a full life, a life that's made whole. Now, these are all words in some ways that are used in Christianity, but sometimes focused in different ways than what he is proposing. So a full or a whole life. He then goes on just simply to kind of matter-of-factly look at the content of the Gospels and say, look, the death of Jesus only comprises at most 10% of the entire story of Jesus, whereas the life of Jesus comprises 9/10. So maybe, again, our focus should pivot to the 9/10. It shows us what a well-lived life looks like, a life fully alive. And he then, from there, chronicles what he says in these first 7 essential sayings, or sayings of prominence, can help us answer that question of what a fully alive life looks like. It shows what Jesus was passionate about. So I think of this sometimes to weave in my own narrative when I meet with families for funerals and I'm asking about their loved one. They tell me about their life. They don't tell me about their death. They tell me about the things they were passionate about. They tell me about the things that inspired them. And that's kind of what he is saying as well. We need to turn the lens about Jesus on its head and stop looking at his death and start looking at what he was passionate about and how that for us can unlock within us the potential of a fully alive life. And he ends with the following questions. He has a series of kind of 5 or 6 questions at the end of them. The quote at the beginning of the chapter reads, "There is more that is important about Jesus than his death. For many Christians, the idea that Jesus did not come to die but to live might be a surprise. In your own spiritual journey, how did the death of Jesus get treated in comparison to the life that he lived?" So how did the death of Jesus get treated in comparison to his life? Number 2, Chloe Benjamin's novel, The Immortalists, raises the timeless question of how we would live if we knew when we were going to die. Seeing as how most of us don't know when, but simply that we will die someday, how does that affect your thinking about living now? If you knew years ago what you now know about living a spiritual life, what would you have done differently? Number 3, the title of this book borrows a line from Mary Oliver's poem about our one wild and precious life. What does that description mean to you? How has your life been wild, precious? How might those same descriptors apply to Jesus' life? As you look at the list of the 7 first words or sayings of Jesus named here, what stands out? Are there some missing you would have added? Are there some included you might omit? By the way, those are follow me, good news to the poor, blessed are the, you give them something to eat, your faith has made you well, the kingdom of God is like, and love of God and neighbor. Those are the 7. Are there particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images that stand out to you in the introduction? How do these things speak to the way you hope to live your one and wild and precious life? And finally, is there an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting what Christianity would be like if it focused more on life before death? Tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. So that's the introduction. Now I'm going to jump from there into the first of the critical sayings or essential sayings, or his, what does he call them here? 7 first words of Jesus, and that's follow me, studying under Jesus. Now, learning to live means a transformation or a change. So part of what he is looking at here is the first thing that Jesus does is call those who become his followers. And so we begin by looking at the people that Jesus invited to follow him and the type of people they were and the level of commitment that they had and the change that he required. So Mike Graves shares how to approach first reading the Bible. So he starts with a primer on how we should approach reading the Bible before he launches into his interpretation. Here's what he says. You have to read backwards, then forwards, or from the back to the front. And what he means is you need to understand that this is written in a different language, biblical Greek for the New Testament. It is from a different culture, and there is a different time in history. So that is backwards. And forwards then is the application for us today. Often what I say in our scripture readings is what we are looking here for is not only the facts. First we read the story and we uncover the facts. That's sort of the backwards piece. What is the language? What is the context? What's happening culturally? Who are the people we're talking about? What does that mean relative to that time and environment? And then we look at, and what truth does this then communicate into our lives today? So there's the forward part. So you go backwards to go forward. So you put it within its context to then bring it into one's own personal context. So he looks at the call of these first followers of Jesus and he says, look, first off, we have ordinary working class folks. These are the fishermen, or the first one's called. These folks are considered in some ways, again, ordinary working class. Then we have the call of some tax collectors is what he has here, or toll collectors, folks that were considered dirty and in cahoots with an occupying force. And so they were not well looked upon. And then there are those that are called who are outwardly opposed to this occupying force, called zealots. And so he's really trying to say there's a whole big variety of people. And we can ask, well, why is it that Jesus called them? And it really has nothing to do with them particularly or a skill set that they bring, even though Jesus sometimes referred to now you'll be fishers of men as a way that seems to lean upon their experience. But he's not really looking at them and their resume and saying, you've got it all and you're right for the job. This is a declaration of acceptance of all, that none were superior or better, and the disciples argue about this throughout the ministry of Jesus, but rather all were called to be part of this, no matter who they were, what they were doing, what their background was, what their family of origin, what they did vocationally or otherwise. All of them across that entire spectrum were called. And he leads from here into his own personal story to basically lay out, I'm going to be a little blunt here, but kind of the degenerate that he was, and how he, in his own journey, got to this different place in following Jesus and accepting this one wild and precious life. And it's his way of saying, if this is true for me, why wouldn't it be true for anybody else? So it's his way, again, backwards, forwards, recognizing who the original disciples are, and then forward into his life to say, there's no reason why I, given the person that I was, should myself be where I'm at or should have received God's grace through Jesus. And then he goes into a series of stories as they are different across different gospels, but also what they mean relative to this. He talks about the rich young ruler who asks Jesus what he's got to do if he's going to follow Jesus. And Jesus says you need to leave everything if you're going to follow, and how that differs in one gospel compared to another. And other stories, Nicodemus coming to him under the guise of night and asking him about what the greatest commandment is in the Gospel of John. And he uses all of these, and if you have the research, you can see all the stories that he refers to, all the gospel accounts he refers to. His intention is to say that for each of us, there is something for us that we have to decide whether we're going to give up or give away, or that we are lacking. And what Jesus calls into question in each of these unique ways, in each of these unique people, is that what they are willing, what they have to give up, what they have to give away, or what they are lacking, so what they have to take on, and ultimately to begin to live their one wild and precious life. So if we take the rich young ruler, Jesus may really not be intending to say you need to give everything you own away, but rather that his entire focus of life has become about maintaining his wealth and keeping it secure. And in so doing, he is unable to really live the life that God sees he is capable of living, that his one wild and precious life, because he's too anchored to this world. So, even passages that talk about how you have to leave your mother and father and your brothers and sisters, that detachment is really more a statement, not that we have to truly stop being around those that we care about or our families of origin, but rather understand that our mentor, the one that really teaches us how to let go and live, is Jesus. And so that means in some ways that we do have to pivot to be willing to study under this one, that we might learn how to live. He uses blindness even as another way to understand this, in saying, while there were some cured of blindness according to the Gospels, we also see that while the disciples journeyed with Jesus, they had this clouded vision. They didn't quite get it all the time. They were blind to the overall purpose. They still messed up. They were slow to catch on. And so being committed to Jesus is a commitment to study under Jesus, to put Jesus as your mentor, to really being following, to learn what is required. So the first essential saying here, the first essential words are a commitment, a willingness to learn. That is the first thing. So it's not so much that we got to go and give up everything, is a willingness to learn, to understand that there's still so much clouded or unclear before us. The Apostle Paul talks about seeing in a mirror dimly, or kind of like a hazed over, fogged over mirror. You can see the outline, but you can't quite see the detail. Well, studying under Jesus is what will help us see the detail of what a life well lived implies and means. And that's the topic for the next chapter. But before we get to that, I want to again take the time to share with you the 6 questions at the end of this first chapter, 7 questions, about this calling, the first lesson here. Are there particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images that stand out to you from this chapter on following Jesus? How do these things speak to the way you hope to live your one wild and precious life? Number 2. Parker Palmer's quote at the beginning of chapter 1 reads, "This life I am living is not the same as the life that wants to live in me." How do you interpret that, considering this chapter on discipleship? The quote again, "This life I am living is not the same as the life that wants to live in me." Number 3, the chapter is organized around another quote, this one by Fred Craddock, who claimed that the essence of Jesus' teaching on following him could be summarized as follow: "Come just as you are, but don't expect to stay that way." What do you make of each of these observations in reading the stories from the Gospels and your own life? The groundwork, number 4, the groundwork for this chapter and all the chapters to come includes reminders on reading the Bible backwards before moving to our day. The Greek language in which the New Testament was written, the thoroughly Jewish culture of Jesus, and the Roman occupation of the Holy Land. How have these things affected your reading of these biblical stories? Number 5, reading forward means applying these ancient stories to our daily lives. When you think about the call of fishermen, toll collectors, zealots, and more, how does that speak to your own spiritual journey? Number 6, the Christian life of discipleship is described as 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. How does that resonate with your own life of studying under Jesus? Do you find this observation challenging or reassuring? What exactly? What might be the one thing lacking in your own spiritual journey? And number 7, is there an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting what being apprenticed by Jesus feels like to you? Tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. So we'll be back next week with chapter 2, Good News to the Poor, Justice for the Most Vulnerable. And this is actually where we're going to begin in relation to worship, but that's only because we had the calling of the disciples twice over in the season of Epiphany. So I figured we could start here, and that also would keep us in line with this concluding the Sunday prior to Palm Sunday, so as we go into that holiest of times. As I said, I'll be joining you every week in this remote way so that those who cannot participate on Thursdays or on Sundays or in conversations outside of those times still have an opportunity to engage with this in some form or fashion. I hope this is useful, and I hope that you're finding a way to grow and stretch spiritually in this season of Lent, and that you might use this as a way to figure out, to learn, to discern how to live your one wild and precious life, to be fully alive in following Jesus and in unleashing the person God knows you are. God bless. We'll see you soon.